I never expected to become entangled in a family drama that would expose decades-old secrets and challenge everything I thought I knew about my grandfather. But that's exactly what happened when a manila envelope arrived at my apartment on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after his funeral. The shocking revelations handwritten on the letter inside it completely changed my life forever. My name is Adele Winters, and until recently, I was just an ordinary third-grade teacher at Oak Ridge Elementary. My life revolved around lesson plans, parent-teacher conferences, and quiet evenings grading papers in my modest one-bedroom apartment. I'd been estranged from my grandfather, Harold Winters, for most of my adult life, not by choice, but by circumstance and the manipulations of others, as I would soon discover. "Miss Winters, there's someone here to see you." Maddie, our school secretary, poked her head into my classroom during lunch break. "He says it's important, something about your grandfather's estate." My heart skipped a beat. 6 months had passed since Grandfather Harold's funeral. A somber affair I attended despite not having seen him in over 15 years. I'd stood in the back of the chapel, watching as my cousin Richard delivered a moving eulogy about their close relationship and how he'd cared for Grandfather in his final days. I smoothed down my cardigan and stepped into the main office, where a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes waited, briefcase in hand. "Miss Adele Winters? I'm Matthew Bennett, your grandfather's former groundskeeper." He extended his hand. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks." I shook his hand, confused. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. My grandfather's estate was settled months ago. My cousin Richard inherited everything." Matthew's expression darkened. "That's why I'm here. What happened wasn't right, and Harold, your grandfather, he would be devastated if he knew." He glanced around the busy school office. "Do you have somewhere private we could talk?" That evening, sitting at my kitchen table, I opened the manila envelope Matthew had given me. Inside was a letter written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting, and a formal document that made my hands tremble. "I found these while clearing out the old tool shed at the estate," Matthew explained. "Mr. Winters had asked me to keep an eye on certain areas of the property that Richard rarely visited. He must have hidden them there before he passed." The letter began simply, "My dearest Adele, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and something has gone terribly wrong." Tears blurred my vision as I read how my grandfather had tried repeatedly to reconnect with me over the years, sending letters and making calls that had somehow never reached me. He wrote about Richard slowly isolating him from family and friends, controlling his communications and manipulating him when his health began to fail. But it was the second document that truly stole my breath. A will dated just 3 months before his death, properly notarized and witnessed, leaving the bulk of his substantial estate to me, with specific provisions for charitable donations and modest bequests to other family members, the estate that Richard now fully controlled. "Richard presented a different will at the probate hearing," Matthew said quietly, "one that left everything to him. No one questioned it because everyone knew he'd been caring for your grandfather." I looked up, stunned. "But this changes everything." Matthew nodded. "It does, if you're willing to fight for it. But Adele, you should know, your grandfather wasn't just wealthy. He was extremely wealthy. The Winters estate includes significant real estate holdings, technology investments, and a venture capital fund focused on healthcare innovation. Richard won't give that up without a battle." That night, I barely slept. I lived comfortably on my teacher's salary, but I wasn't wealthy by any means. The thought of challenging Richard, who had apparently hired the city's most prestigious law firm to handle the probate, seemed impossible. But then I remembered the letter, my grandfather's words. "Adele, you have always been stronger than you know. When your parents died, I wanted to raise you myself, but Richard convinced me you were better off with your aunt. It was the greatest mistake of my life, allowing him to come between us." By morning, I had made my decision. I would fight for my grandfather's true wishes, not for the money itself, but for the truth, and to reclaim the relationship that had been stolen from both of us. I called in sick to school and made an appointment with Marissa Lloyd, a scrappy attorney known for taking on difficult inheritance cases. Her office was nothing like the gleaming downtown tower where Richard's legal team worked. It was tucked above a coffee shop in a converted Victorian house, with mismatched furniture and case files stacked in organized chaos. So, you're going up against Maxwell, Pratt, and Associates? Marissa raised an eyebrow after reviewing my documents. They have 50 attorneys and bill $750 an hour. I'm just me and my paralegal Gabe when he's not in law school classes. Does that mean you won't take the case? My heart sank. She smiled, a determined glint in her eye. Quite the opposite, Miss Winters. I love nothing more than watching Goliath fall. But you need to understand what you're getting into. This won't just be expensive and time-consuming. Richard will make it personal. It already is personal, I replied, thinking of all the years lost with my grandfather. He stole more than money from me. I didn't have to wait long for Marissa's warning to prove true. 3 days after we filed the petition to challenge the probate, I returned home to find an eviction notice on my apartment door. The building had supposedly been sold, and all tenants had 30 days to vacate. That's not a coincidence, Marissa said when I called her in a panic. The property management company that just bought your building? It's a subsidiary of Winters Ventures. Richard's now controlling it. The next day, the principal at Oak Ridge called me into her office. Adele, I've received some concerning information about you, she began uncomfortably. A parent has come forward claiming you were inappropriate with their child. My blood ran cold. That's absolutely false. Who would say such a thing? She slid a folder across her desk. The complaint was filed by Councilman Blake. His daughter isn't even in your class, which is why I'm not putting you on immediate leave, but will need to investigate. Councilman Blake, Richard's best friend since college. By the end of the week, my car had been vandalized. My credit score had mysteriously plummeted, and 3 separate job offers I'd applied for just in case had been rescinded without explanation. He's trying to break you financially and emotionally, Marissa explained during an emergency meeting in her office. It's actually good news. It means our case is strong enough that he's scared. How is any of this good news? I asked, fighting back tears of frustration. Because desperate people make mistakes, she replied, and Richard is showing just how desperate he is. What Richard hadn't counted on was the network of people who had quietly resented his control over my grandfather, but had been too intimidated to speak up. It started with Matthew, who introduced me to Sophie, my grandfather's former nurse. Richard fired me when I questioned why Adele's get-well cards never reached Harold during his hospital stay, she revealed. He claimed you never sent any, but I saw them in the mail. Then came Dr. Levine, my grandfather's physician of 30 years. Harold spoke of you often, especially near the end, he told me over coffee. He was devastated thinking you wanted nothing to do with him. When I suggested reaching out directly, Richard always had a reason why that would be harmful to Harold's recovery. One by one, people from my grandfather's life emerged. His favorite barista, his tailor, his weekly poker group, each with stories of how Richard had systematically isolated him, especially from me. Most valuable of all was Irene Foster, my grandfather's executive assistant for over 2 decades, who had been abruptly retired when he fell ill. I've been keeping records, she said, sliding a USB drive across the table during our meeting. Emails, calendar entries, altered documents. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't prove it while Harold was alive. Richard was too careful around him. The drive contained a goldmine of evidence. Emails showing Richard had intercepted my communications, documentation of questionable financial transactions in the months before my grandfather's death, and most damning of all, a draft of the fraudulent will with tracked changes in Richard's own account. As we built our case, I learned more about my grandfather's business empire than I had ever known while he was alive. What had begun as a modest real estate company in the 1970s had evolved into a sophisticated investment firm with significant holdings in tech startups, particularly in healthcare, AI, and automation. Your grandfather was something of a visionary, explained Jordan Nakamura, the CEO of MediSync, one of my grandfather's most successful investments. He recognized the potential of artificial intelligence in diagnostic medicine long before it was trendy. He funded our neural network research when no one else would touch it. Jordan had reached out after hearing about the will contest through industry channels. Richard has been trying to force a sale of Harold's stake in our company to a competitor who would shut down our non-profit hospital initiative. That's not what your grandfather wanted. Similar stories emerged from other portfolio companies. Richard systematically undermining the ethical frameworks my grandfather had insisted upon, prioritizing quick profits over the sustainable growth and social impact that had apparently been central to my grandfather's business philosophy. Harold wasn't just wealthy, Jordan told me. He was influential in shaping how technology serves humanity. Richard is dismantling that legacy piece by piece. The stakes were growing far beyond a simple inheritance. This was about honoring not just my grandfather's final wishes, but his life's work. 4 months into our legal battle, Richard's desperation peaked. The evidence was mounting against him, and his attorneys had failed twice to get our case dismissed. I was leaving a deposition when a sleek black car pulled alongside me in the parking garage, the window lowered to reveal Richard's perfectly composed face. "Get in, Adele. Let's talk like family." Against my better judgment, but with the voice memo app recording on my phone, I slid into the passenger seat. "You're making a mistake," he said smoothly, not bothering with pleasantries. "A very public, very expensive mistake." "The only mistake was not questioning how you managed to isolate my grandfather so completely," I replied, surprised by my own steadiness. He laughed, a hollow sound. "Harold was a sentimental old fool. All that talk about ethical business and responsible innovation. Do you know how much money he left on the table with those philosophies? The man was sitting on a gold mine and treating it like a charity. That was his choice to make. And now it's mine." His voice hardened. "Here's my offer. I'll set up a trust for you. $5 million. More than enough for a school teacher. Walk away, drop the case, sign an NDA, and never speak of this again." $5 million was indeed life-changing money. For a moment, I wondered if I should take it. And the stress, the uncertainty, the increasingly personal attacks. "What happens to MediSync's hospital program?" I asked. "And the sustainable housing development in Oakland? The scholarship foundation?" Richard waved dismissively. "Business decisions, not your concern." I thought about all the people who had trusted my grandfather, who had believed in his vision. I thought about the years of relationships stolen from us, and I knew what my answer had to be. "I'm going to have to decline," I said, reaching for the door handle. His face contorted with rage, the careful mask slipping. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be lucky to get a job teaching in a prison." I stepped out of the car, but turned back one last time. "You know, Richard, for someone so focused on the bottom line, you missed my grandfather's most valuable asset." "What's that?" he sneered. "The people who believed in him, who still believe in what he stood for." The car peeled away, leaving the scent of burnt rubber in the air, and his entire unguarded rant safely recorded on my phone. The recording proved to be the tipping point. Not only had Richard essentially confessed to manipulating my grandfather and the will, but he'd also admitted to plans that would have constituted securities fraud regarding several of the portfolio companies. With this new evidence, Marissa convinced the judge to freeze the estate assets pending resolution and to appoint an independent administrator. Richard's legal team, sensing disaster, began floating settlement offers, each larger than the last. But something unexpected had happened to me throughout this process. The teacher who had lived a quiet, unassuming life had found her voice. The more I learned about my grandfather's vision for his wealth, the more I realized this fight was about something larger than money. He wanted to use his success to make a difference, I explained to Marissa when she presented Richard's latest settlement offer. "I can't just take a payout and walk away from that responsibility." She studied me with newfound respect. "You know, you remind me of how people described your grandfather before Richard took over his affairs. Quietly determined, principled." "I wish I'd known him then," I said softly. "Maybe this is your chance to honor who he really was," she replied. The final breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Claire, Richard's wife of 15 years, contacted Marissa requesting a private meeting. "I can't do this anymore," she said, hands trembling around her coffee cup as we sat in a quiet corner of a cafe 3 towns over from where she lived. "Richard has always been ambitious, but what he did to Harold? To you, It's unforgivable. She slid a thumb drive across the table. Everything is here: banking records, private emails, the original will that Richard destroyed. Harold had sent a scan to our home email, and Richard didn't realize I had access. Why are you doing this? I asked. You have to know what it will mean for your lifestyle. Claire's perfectly made-up face crumpled slightly. When we first married, Richard was driven but ethical. The man he's become, I don't recognize him anymore. And I've been complicit through my silence. She took a steadying breath. Harold was kind to me even when Richard began shutting him out of decision-making. I owe him this much. The evidence Claire provided was the final piece we needed. Marissa compiled everything into an airtight case that even Richard's high-powered legal team couldn't dismantle. The courthouse was packed on the day of the final hearing. Word had spread throughout the business community and among my grandfather's extensive social network. Richard sat stone-faced with his attorneys, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. When the judge ruled in our favor, invalidating the fraudulent will and accepting my grandfather's true final testament, the room erupted in applause. Richard stormed out, already on his phone, likely calling on whatever connections he had left to salvage his reputation. "Congratulations, Miss Winters," the judge said with a small smile. "Your grandfather would be proud of your perseverance." Outside the courthouse, surrounded by well-wishers, many of whom had been my grandfather's friends and colleagues, I felt overwhelmed by the responsibility that now rested on my shoulders. Jordan from Medisync squeezed my arm. "Don't worry. We'll help you navigate all this. Harold always said you had good judgment. That's why he wanted you to oversee his legacy." "But I'm just a teacher," I protested. "I don't know the first thing about venture capital or healthcare technology." "You know right from wrong," said Irene, my grandfather's former assistant. Harold believed that was the most important quality in a business leader. Everything else can be learned. I didn't give up teaching immediately. Instead, I reduced to part-time while learning about my grandfather's business interests. I established the Harold Winters Foundation to oversee the charitable aspects of his estate, with Matthew, Sophie, and Dr. Levine among its board members. The Foundation's first project was a technology education initiative for underprivileged schools, bringing cutting-edge learning tools to communities that would otherwise be left behind in the digital economy. Standing in the first classroom equipped with our program, watching children explore virtual science labs with wonder in their eyes, I felt my grandfather's presence more strongly than I ever had before. Richard eventually faced legal consequences beyond losing the inheritance. The financial manipulations Claire had documented resulted in criminal charges. The last I heard, he had taken a plea deal and was serving time in a minimum security facility. As for me, the quiet school teacher who had once been intimidated by confrontation, I found strength I never knew I had. The wealth itself didn't change who I was at my core, but it amplified my ability to effect positive change, just as my grandfather had intended. Sometimes, late at night, while reviewing reports from our healthcare AI researchers or sustainable housing developers, I imagine my grandfather sitting across from me, nodding in approval. We may have lost years together due to Richard's deception, but in fighting for his true legacy, I found a way to know him after all. My grandfather's forgotten will wasn't just a legal document that transferred wealth. It was his final lesson to me, that standing up for what's right, especially when it's difficult, is the most valuable inheritance of all. And that's a legacy worth fighting for. Hope you enjoyed this tale. Have you ever had major issues over money, betrayal, or other events? Drop your wildest stories in the comments. Let's chat about it. And more importantly, let's learn from it. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more real-life stories you won't forget in a hurry.